Hello and welcome to Chess Goblin. If you're watching this video, that means one of the most anticipated tournaments of the year, Norway Chess, has begun. And the most anticipated matchup of this tournament has commenced. Magnus Carlsen versus 18-year-old prodigy and world champion Gukesh played. Norway Chess is a very interesting format. It is a double round robin. There's a male field and a female field, and they play a double round robin. 6 players in each side. An absolute studded field. And it's a 2-hour game. It starts off with a classical 2-hour game. And if you win the classical game, it's 3 points. If you draw the classical game, both players go into an Armageddon, where white has 10 minutes, black has 7. And the winner of that Armageddon gets 1.5 points, and the loser would get 1 point. So it's very beneficial to win these classical games. This game that I'm going to show you has been called the Game of the Year. And it is just that. And it starts out, Magnus has the white pieces, and he starts out with a London. Very system opening, but don't worry, this gets more exciting. Gukesh pushes the pawn, a sort of gambit opening. Magnus just holds straight to the London. Gukesh playing the mainline moves. Magnus bringing out his bishop. We see a trade. And now here is where the first interesting move comes in. You would probably think the most intuitive move would be maybe this knight on g1 goes and takes it. If Magnus wants to be interesting, maybe he'll take with the queen. But instead, we see him capture with the knight from c3. His knight that he brought out, now he's rerouting back, and he left one on the back row instead. Magnus wants to take Gukesh. Out of his theory, Gukesh is a very prepared player. He's just won the world championship, and he has all these openings far calculated and knows so many openings. Magnus would do much better in a middle or endgame against Gukesh, or if he can take him out of a mainline opening. Gukesh brings out his knight. We see Magnus develop his other knight. And it's just regular developing moves here for a while. Just sliding his rook over, just trying to slowly improve their positions. And then Gukesh brings his queen out, threatening the pawn on a2. Magnus moves it up, so it's defended. Gukesh slides his rook over, and Magnus shoves this pawn forward to h4. If he can blow up this side in front of the king, making Gukesh's king vulnerable, that would be very beneficial for Magnus. And that's what he tries to do. Gukesh slides his queen over, Magnus hopping in his knight, and Gukesh is just trying to trade off pieces. Hops his knight back. Magnus doesn't want to trade off pieces, though. He wants to keep the pieces on the board. Slides his bishop back. And then Gukesh offers queen trade. But Magnus doesn't want that either. He wants to keep the pieces on the board. And then another piece trade Gukesh is offering. Magnus's bishop is locked in, so it gets traded off. And then here is a very important move for Gukesh. And in this position, he wants to try to undermine this d4 pawn. Not only attacking it with the c pawn, but now he's shoved forward the e pawn to attack it also. And also attacking Magnus's queen, so he has to step it back. And Gukesh is not hitting mate in 1. If, for example, he took this piece here, then we would see the world champion hang mate in 1. But Gukesh doesn't fall for that. He slides his queen over, and we see a trade-off of queens. Magnus hop his knight back, and then we see the middle start get torn apart. And here, Magnus recaptures back, Gukesh slides his pawn up, not creating a hanging pawn for himself. Instead, slides it forward, not be creating an isolated pawn, I mean. If he, for example, took it here, Magnus can recapture, and then it's an isolated pawn. Gukesh doesn't do that, though. He captures, and then pushes his pawn. And here, Magnus hops his knight back to try to reroute it around. And that's what he does. We see Gukesh hop his knight in. Magnus slide his rook over. And the reason why in this position, you'd think that he just forked these two pawns here and why he doesn't just capture it. If, for example, he captured this pawn here, Gukesh can then slide his rook over, hitting the knight and the pawn, and after knight hops and captures another pawn, Gukesh slides his rook in. Now his knight's under attack, and after Magnus tries to hop it away, he can slide his rook over here. He tries to defend this pawn, then Gukesh has his line where he can bring his knight out, and then he's threatening this pawn. And this pawn here is going to be very vulnerable with these two powerful rooks here, and it's just a nightmare for Magnus here. Although it's not, according to the computer, not very bad. Magnus can play a lot more comfortable positions if he did not capture this pawn. And that's why he just slid his rook over instead. And here, Gukesh slides his rook over, and Magnus is just slowly improving his position. And throughout this game, both these players have been playing almost the best move each time. A super accurate game. Gukesh slides his pawn up, and then Magnus shoves his pawn up. And you can't have a game of the year without an en passant. See a recapture, trade off of pawns, Gukesh offering a rook trade, but Magnus declines it. Gukesh slides his rook over, attacking the pawn on e3. Magnus defends it. Gukesh gives a check, and he slides his king up. Now Gukesh is up a pawn, but we slowly see that go away. Now it's back materially equal. Gukesh attacks the pawn. Magnus defends it. We see Gukesh offer another pawn trade. And there's no great way for Magnus to hang on to this pawn for a long time, because bringing the rook over is very uncomfortable, and he wants to start shoving these pawns through the center. So he trades off the pawns. Then he slides his rooks over. So he can trade off rooks. Now we see a pawn trade in the center. And here, according to the computer, it's perfectly equal. In this position, they have the same pieces on the board, but Magnus has two pawns in the center, and Gukesh has two pawns on the outside. Both of them are pushing for a queen here. Gukesh pushes his pawn. Magnus pushes his pawn. And in this position, there's a couple different variations that work, such as bringing your knight over. You can bring it to d7 here. You can bring it over here to h5. But Gukesh plays the most interesting line, sacrificing the knight by just pushing the pawn. And here's another line that works. A very sharp line where he sacrifices his knight. Magnus captures it, and he just keeps pushing his pawn to get that queen. And then we see them both. Gukesh first give a check here, and then they both queen. Now they've reclaimed more pieces on the board, and they head into a very dangerous, one of the most dangerous endgames that you can play, when the queens are on the board. It's perfectly equal, but with one bad move, it's all over. Gukesh, now in this position, has to play the move rook g2. Anything else and he is losing. But instead, he finds the wrong check. That's a mistake. Because if, for example, he played rook g2, after Magnus brings his king up, he has to play then rook g3. And if Magnus ever brings his king up here, that's losing, because then the queen hits the king and the rook. And if he moved his king away, he loses his knight. So he would have to block it with the queen, but then he also loses his rook, and he just cannot hang on to everything. So then Magnus would end up having to slide his king back down. Then Gukesh would have to slide his rook. He cannot slide his queen in this position because then there's blocks with the knight. So then he would have to slide his rook down and end up into a perpetual such as this. But instead, Gukesh finds the wrong check. But this is not just an easy endgame for Magnus here. Although he is the endgame GOAT, he must find the right moves. And in this position, Magnus has to walk his king over to the edge and then walk it up. And all the checks will then dry up. And he finds it. Gukesh gives us another check. Magnus just walks his king. And now both players are under a minute on the clock. Magnus is winning, but he must play perfectly here to survive. Gukesh gives another check. Magnus walks his king. And he does just each move perfectly. Gukesh gives another check. Magnus walks his king. And here, after moves like Queen c2, Magnus would then have to walk his king over here. And now there's no more checks. The checks will be completely gone. And he can never capture this knight because losing that initiative is even worse. And in this position, Gukesh captures the knight. A fatal mistake. Magnus has to find the right moves with under a minute on the clock. He has to find every move perfectly. And he starts off his sequence with Queen h8. Gukesh runs his king up. Magnus gives another check. Gukesh's king runs. And in here, only one move works. And Magnus finds it again. Gukesh runs his king. And here, it's kind of a tricky spot in the game. The most natural move would seem maybe Queen h8. But then you see the eval bar just drop to equal. Because after the king moves, although you're taking this pawn, skewering the king to the rook, now there is a perpetual check that the king cannot escape. After Queen c4, his rook is getting hit. And if he moves his king, then he's getting the rook and a check. So if he protects the rook, then there's a check here, and it ends up into perpetual. But instead, with 15 seconds on the clock, Magnus finds the right move, rook e6. And with this move, Gukesh resigns, and Magnus wins the game. And why, may you ask, would he resign in this position? There's only a couple moves that Gukesh can do. If he moved king like to d3, then Magnus would slide his queen over. After queen goes here, then he's hitting the king and skewering the queen. And that, with Magnus having a queen versus a rook and a pawn endgame, it's all but over. And if, for example, he slid his king to d3 here, then Magnus can hit the king and also pick up this rook. And if he moves king like there, then he just gets a free queen, and it's all but over. Crazy game. A sharp game. But it ended with Magnus on top. If you have enjoyed this video, please hit that like button down below. It really helps. And subscribe if you have not already done before. I hope to see you in the next video.